Erev Tov, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to the Anshe Emet Synagogue. We're very glad that everyone's here tonight. And we welcome those who are joining us online. Hillel Halkin, a thoughtful writer and an astute observer of Israel for decades, wrote in the winter edition of the Jewish Review of Books, "Each day brings developments that were inconceivable a short while ago. No, excuse me, it's not the end of Israeli democracy, but it is the end of an Israeli consensus about what is and is not permissible in a democracy. And once the rules are no longer agreed on, political chaos is not far away. Israel has never been in such a place before." This was published in the winter of 2022. At the time, there were many who thought that Hillel Halkin was being hyperbolic, that he was exaggerating. 4 months after this article was published, I think that we can all agree that he was not exaggerating. Legislation that will have a significant impact on the power of the Supreme Court and how judges are chosen, and in some ways the balance of power in the government continues to quickly work its way through the Knesset. Last Saturday night, hundreds of thousands of Israelis marched across Israel for the 11th week in a row in protest. Members of the IDF have said they will not serve if the legislation passes. Some in elite units are not showing up for reserve duty. In an unprecedented act, the President of Israel has appeared on primetime television multiple times now, offering his services to mediate the crisis. Some are predicting that the end of democracy is near. Others that a civil war is brewing in Israel. Others are calling for a constitutional convention, and others still are claiming that this is all an overblown effort by those on the left to bring the government of Prime Minister Netanyahu down. Large Israeli tech firms are responding to the crisis by pulling their money out of Israel. Banking experts are predicting disaster, and the value of the shekel continues to plummet. Finally, a riot took place in a Palestinian town when hundreds of Israeli Jews marched in protest of the murder of two brothers. Homes were burned, people were beaten, and perpetrators went largely unpunished. Israel's finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, supported a tweet that spoke of wiping out the village of Hurara, which he has since apologized for. However, last night in Paris, Minister Bezalel Smotrich said that the Palestinian people were an invention from the last century, and that people like himself and his grandparents were the real Palestinians. The Netanyahu government has ministers who have expressed clear homophobic views, some who openly venerate Meir Kahane and Baruch Goldstein. Members of the American government have refused to meet with some of them in both Israel and the United States. Petitions refusing them entry to Jewish institutions have been signed by a number of organizations. I would go on further, but suffice it to say that we are in uncharted waters. And it's time that we had a public conversation to think about what's happening in Israel and how American Jews who care deeply about the Jewish state should respond. And to help us in this task, I've invited Yinam Cohen, the Consul General of Israel to the Midwest. Yinam is a career diplomat with 16 years of experience in the Israel Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Before arriving in Chicago, he held the position of Senior Policy Advisor to Foreign Minister Gabi Ashkenazi and Director of the Policy Department in the Minister's Bureau. I should also mention that the Consul General had an eye procedure before coming here, and we're really grateful that he managed to get here tonight. And if he squints a little at me, we'll just assume he's not giving me the stink eye. Daniel Goldwin is the Executive Director of Public Affairs of the Jewish Community Relations Council, the JCRC, and the Government Affairs Department at the JUF, the Jewish United Fund of Metropolitan Chicago. Dan oversees the Jewish Community Relations Council, the umbrella body for more than 40 Chicago area Jewish organizations, and operates as JUF's Community Relations Division. He also leads the Government Affairs Department, whose mission is to promote public policies and legislation at all levels of government that support the health and human services provided by JUF's network of affiliated agencies. This includes enhancing the interests of the Jewish community, both domestically and overseas, building and strengthening relationships with elected and appointed government officials, and educating and engaging the Jewish community in public policy advocacy. I should also note that Dan and his family are members of our Anshe Emet community. Sarah Van Loon is the Evelyn R. Greene AJC Chicago Regional Director. The American Jewish Committee was founded in 1906, making it one of the oldest Jewish advocacy organizations in the United States. Through a global network of offices, institutes, and international partnerships, AJC engages with leaders at the highest level of government and civil society to counter anti-Semitism, to advocate for Israel, and advance democratic values. I want to tell you in advance that I work closely with these three people on a regular basis. And I can also tell you that the Jewish community of Chicago and the Midwest are well served by each of them. And I'd like to invite everyone to welcome them with a round of applause. Our goal tonight is to speak to the many in our community who care deeply about Israel, but may be unsure as to how to respond to the current legislative and democratic crisis in Israel. We're not gathering to discuss the merits of either position or offer solutions. I realize that is a very un-Jewish thing to do, but we will refrain from doing that tonight. Rather, the goal is to have a thoughtful conversation about how we are responding within our individual organizations. What's the role of American Jewry at a time such as this? What's the place for criticism and its limits, and what are its limits in the American Jewish community when it comes to Israel? And we're also going to try to take a glimpse into the future of the relationship between American and Israeli Jewry and the way forward. There will be time for questions from the audience as well at the very end. But to set up the evening, I want to begin with a few questions that I would ask everyone to please respond to. Last week, something unprecedented happened. President Herzog spoke on primetime television again, offering to mediate a compromise regarding the Supreme Court legislation. But this time, he offered a framework for negotiation. 17 minutes later, Prime Minister Netanyahu rejected his plan and offer. So, when you heard about this, what was your reaction? Let's start with you, Sarah.
Well, you had asked before, what was our reaction to Herzog coming out at all about criticism or otherwise, and were we surprised? And no, it's Israel. I'm not surprised to hear one Jewish leader criticize another. But for me, to answer your specific question, I was disappointed that 17 minutes after a compromise framework was put out, no air of even if it was for show, there was no thoughtfulness per se to consider the compromise, to be willing to put on airs to come to that table. And as an advocacy organization that is first and foremost, that thinks of ourselves as the diplomats for the Jewish people, I struggle with that because we are all about finding ways to come to the table.
Dan.
I'll agree with what Sarah said. I would say a federation, and I think not just JUF, but most of the federations around the country strongly supported what President Herzog was trying to do. There was a letter that was sent from the Jewish federations in North America that JUF signed on to. It was an open letter encouraging the Prime Minister and the opposition leader, Yair Lapid, to get together, get around the table, begin the process of hammering something out. We think that's the right way to go. That was the message that was sent this past week by 30 different federation professionals that were on the ground in Israel, specifically to meet with the government, with the opposition, including my colleague Ofer Bavli from our Jerusalem office, David Brown from here in Chicago, to convey that message. Again, not bringing a dictate as to, here's what we think you should do, other than to say, talk. And we would hope that. We hope there's still a chance for that to happen.
Well,
Consul General.
yes, I'm in a special position here, so I'm not going to be judgmental on any position of any Israel side. I can just offer some of the insights. So even though officially the proposal of the president was rejected by the government, I think that if you look at what happened afterwards, there is a deep understanding within the government that a lot of concessions should be taken and should be made. The government today decided, that's a hard word for me. Unilaterally to, thank you, Dan, to step back from some of the legislation initiatives that were on the table and to change some others in a way that is still debatable, but it does mean that the public opinion does affect what the government wants or is aiming to do, and not only the public opinion, but the special character or the special position of the president. Now, as you know, in negotiations, every no is a basis for new negotiations. So I truly do not believe that this is the end of the story. We're probably just seeing the beginning of that. And I truly believe that in the end of the day, the proposal of the president would be a very good basis, maybe with some changes here, others there, but it would be a very good and strong basis for any solution that the country would probably see in the upcoming weeks or months. And it doesn't mean that the road is not going to be bumpy. But I think that in the end of the road, there is I can't say consensus might be too optimistic right now, but there is strong concessions from the government, because I think in the end of the day the government understands. The Prime Minister himself said that we are listening very carefully to the voices on the streets of Israel, and listen to the voices that you, Rabbi Siegel, mentioned too, from the private sector, from our security establishment, and so on, would probably lead to a concession.
It should be mentioned that there were those who would be considered centrists in Israel who were also critical of President Herzog, who felt that he didn't go far enough in trying to address some of the needs of the farther right in his initial proposal. However, I also want to underscore the notion that it is unusual for the President of Israel to come out publicly and challenge the Prime Minister. That, I think, is unprecedented in the history of Israel. For most of the history, the President has been a venerated, but also not seen as a player on the political scene in that way. So I think that was an unusual thing to see.
It was unprecedented in unprecedented times that we live in Israel right now. So that itself is not a big surprise.
Okay. Each of you, and I'm gonna start with you, Consul General Cohen, because I want to acknowledge that you have done an excellent job since coming to Chicago in creating relationships with public officials throughout the Midwest. You know, and it has taken you to some places that I imagine you never thought you would visit along the way. And you have really done your work to develop strong relationships with elected officials all through the Midwest. And certainly, Dan and Sarah, that's your work as well, and you work hard at that all the time, trying to be in contact with elected officials to ensure that they have a clear understanding of how to think about Israel in the moment, to contextualize things, and et cetera. So, what are you hearing from elected officials today? What are the messages that you're receiving on your end that we might not be privy to? And obviously, we're not asking you to divulge any state secrets, but what's the general tenor of what you're hearing? Yinam.
Well, I have to say that the United States is as diverse politically as Israel is, at least. So there are many voices across the region here, from, I would say, both sides of the aisle, to put it this way. And they're very diverse. I think there is still a very large consensus in American politics and among American elected officials about the strength of the relations, of the special bond between our countries, and about the necessity of maintaining this special bond. Now, it has many faces and it has many aspects, and what we're trying to do is to make sure that even in cases where there might be some differences in the perceptions about certain issues, the broad picture is maintained as it is. Just to give you an example, just recently last week, or the week before last week, a group of very friendly congressmen, Jewish congressmen, all of them members of the Democratic Party, published an open letter to Israeli leadership, urging them to find consensus and to maintain the shared values that Israel and America both believe in. For me, it's, this letter is just a testament to the importance that our friends, the legislator, attribute to the strong relations between Israel and America. So we might see sometimes things a bit differently, but I think that from the American left, whatever that means, because it's a bit different in Israel, I don't want to talk about the ultra-left, but from the left all the way to the strong conservatives here in America, there's a broad consensus about the basic elements that bind us together, and that is our shared belief in democracy, in freedom, in liberties, in Israel being still the only democracy in the Middle East, and the fact that the alliance between our countries serves Israel to a great extent, but also is very beneficial to the United States.
So I think the questions I'm getting now from some elected officials, some appointed officials, some just civic leaders, really reflect what we're all feeling in the community. A lot of they don't know. A lot of us are in here probably reading Jerusalem Post or Israel Hayom or Times of Israel, so we're gathering a lot of information. Most elected officials are just catching the chyron along the bottom of the news, where they see a photograph of a protest in Tel Aviv and they're trying to put the pieces together. So getting more questions than opinions. The problem is when opinions come in frequently, they're done through the wrong lens, I think. Because there's a lot of conversations right now about Israel and checks and balances and constitutionality and so forth. Those are American concepts. And our American system of government is peculiar to us, just as is the Israeli system of government is peculiar to it. And I think applying the same language, the same norms and so forth between the two isn't fair. So I spent a fair amount of time breaking that down and helping people understand. But it's also become a really interesting time for me to re-impress upon people, especially elected officials and civic leaders, the importance of going to Israel and understanding it. Because I have two different conversations. Those religious leaders and civic leaders, elected officials who have been to Israel, they call me and they have a different context. They understand a bit more about how the Knesset operates. They understand a bit more about what Israel is up against, what it means to be in that part of the world. And then we have those who've never been but feel like they have, therefore they have to have a really strong opinion. And I took a group of 8 organized labor leaders, union presidents, to Israel in December. And the conversations I'm having with them right now are very, very different than they probably would have been had to have those conversations in November, because they have a different context and a different understanding. But right now, we're getting the phone calls. There's a lot of misunderstanding or a lot of lack of understanding, and really and as they dig into it, they're getting just about an inch deep and maybe a mile wide, but not much more than that.
Sarah?
Very much the same as what Dan is describing, and similarly for us with EJC, we bring leaders of all different backgrounds, you name it, legislative, ethnic, religious, cultural, media, to Israel through EJC's Project Interchange. And in fact, I had the great privilege and pleasure just last week here at Anshe Emet. EJC hosted our Diplomat, Interfaith, and Community Leaders Seder, and I had a Project Interchange alum there. And they were talking about their experience traveling with us, and I will brag to you all, because I have the privilege of doing so right here, of their unique experience traveling with us there, and that AJC through our Project Interchange trip will show Israel warts and all. So when he was asking me about what was going on in Israel, and kind of similar, I haven't had a chance to dive in, I'm sure you're consumed with this all day long, so tell me what I'm not getting, because I know you'll tell it to me straight. I know you'll tell me good, bad, and the unclear still. And so I was able to communicate that as much of, there's a lot that's happening right now. A part of our job is not so much to wait and see, but to encourage compromise, to encourage members of the government to come together and to create as broad of a consensus as possible, and to kind of go from there. But we're not here as American citizens who, yes, have a very vested interest in what's happening in Israel, especially as American Jews, particularly as committed Zionists, but we don't live there. We don't serve in the army there. We don't vote there. So it's also understanding as American Jews where our opportunities or our lane, for lack of a better phrase, begins and ends.
In my own conversations with not only leaders but religious leaders, one of the things that I try to point out is that wherever you are in the spectrum of the protests or in the government, one of the differences between Israel and the United States is that no one is advocating tearing down the democracy. Everyone is on the same Israeli side. Everyone is supporting the state. No one is challenging the legitimacy of the state of Israel. And that's a very different conversation. So I would say that the people who are, that this is a very heated conversation between very patriotic people on both sides.
Yeah, and I'd add one thing, it occurred to me, I talked to someone recently who had been to Israel with us, and they said if you took the images of the few 100,000 people in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem marching, and you dropped those images into Beirut or Tripoli, you would have seen tanks in the street, you would have seen a mass casualty event. And this person said, they literally said, "You go girl," is what this person said to me. It's like, the Israelis, this is democracy. They are protesting, they are protected in their protest. And they said that to them was an interesting thing, is they were trying to contrast that with trying to imagine 200,000 people marching through Cairo and what that would look like and what the results would be.
Right. So beginning with you, Dan, what do you believe the 3 biggest challenges of the moment for the state of Israel are in order of importance? And just to take note of the fact that everyone's seen the questions in advance, so I'm not just throwing this in the
I wasn't
slide.
trying to remember the in order of importance part. So, but I'll start with communal cohesion. We all know the joke, 3 Israelis or 3 Jews, 4 opinions. But through the entire arc of Israeli history, no matter how much tension or infighting there could be, when push came to shove, the Israelis came back together. And the Jewish people came back together around the world to back the Israelis. I fear that now. It's not different than I feared some ways here in the United States as well. There's a fraying of that kind of cohesion, so I worry about that. The second sort of big issue I think facing is that there's a real desire to extend the circle of peace. We've seen it with the Abraham Accords, obviously, is the best example. But I'll compare with that not only the circle of peace, but the idea of this robust model economy for the world. And peace is hard to grow and economies are hard to improve when there's a real sense of instability. And even though what I just said, that Israelis are marching through the streets freely and they're protesting with freedom of speech and so forth, there's still a sense of uncertainty. What's with the rule of law? Is there not rule of law? Is this being challenged? And it's really hard to convince Saudi Arabia, hey, now's the perfect time to come into the Abraham Accords. So that's 2. And then 3 is the ongoing stressors with the Palestinians. I was in Israel a number of years ago, and I met with the U.S. representative on UNRWA. And he told us the thing that he was most scared about was not Israeli-Palestinian violence, but Palestinian on Palestinian violence, because he couldn't send his people into certain camps to provide aid and so forth. And we always knew that's bubbling. But there had been a sort of a quiet status quo that had been existing between the Israelis and Palestinians. And I think that is certainly fraying. Mahmoud Abbas is 87 years old, a chain smoker, some form of cancer, no one's exactly sure what he has. So I fear what that means. There was an important meeting yesterday in Sharm el-Sheikh, which was following up on a meeting from 2 weeks ago in Aqaba, trying to sort of keep things mellow. But I use these words carefully, but it's not my own words, but the director of the CIA warned about a potential 3rd intifada. And if you layer that on top of the other 2 things I just said, that's a problem.
Sarah.
Mine are very similar to Dan's, and I promise you all here, we weren't, sitting up here beforehand saying, oh, what were you going to answer to this? What were you going to answer to that? But, Israelis have gone through how many elections in the last several years? And so I think about that in the broader context of democracy. On the one hand, yes, that shows democracy at play. But on the other hand, I'm very worried about the young generation of Israeli Jews and non-Jewish Israelis and what they think about this, if this is what it comes to, whether they vote or don't vote. So I'm concerned about that nature of democracy. My point number 2 is also democracy, the ways in which the government goes about formulating their compromise, and I'm putting that out there with the hopes that that is where it ends up. But also for me, the third is what this current situation is allowing in terms of distractions. So you named the Abraham Accords. There's so much more, not only to celebrate, but to deepen, to build upon. There's so much more opportunity there. And we're not going to see that happening if the distractions of what's happening with the current government continue. So that has far greater implications to so many other sectors of Israeli life, to American Jewish engagement, that I think we're still going to, as these protests drag on, we're only going to continue to see what that looks like. And as you've put it, or you just said it, the way in which Americans are also projecting our American perception on it. The world is doing the same. So the longer that this is drawn out, I think the more misunderstanding or lack of desire to engage will become more apparent. That's not what we want to see. With American Jewish Committee, we want to see Israel proudly engaged in the community of nations. So that's part of our advocacy goals and direction, is to help ensure that happening. The current fighting between the government doesn't really support that end. Makes it a lot more challenging.
Yinam.
I totally agree with my colleagues, but I think that if I want to answer this question correctly, I need to give some context. And just, the exercise we should all do is try to really zoom out for a moment. And it's really hard because when we follow, as you said, every day brings unprecedented news, and it's sometimes hard to say, hard to do because of the intensity of the events. But I think that if we really zoom out right now, what we will see is that Israel is in a moment of constitutional crisis, which by itself is very special since, we have a constitutional crisis without even having a constitution. That's a great Jewish invention. But what's happening now is that the old order in Israel, that the foundations of Israeli society and politics that have been there for the last decades are now proven less and less relevant for the contemporary Israel. And I think that exactly because of this crisis, we might have an opportunity, because every crisis is also an opportunity. And the opportunity is to shape a new order in Israel, a new social order, a new political order. I also want to say, for the long term, also an opportunity to discuss our basic foundations as a constitution, for example. And this process, the collapse of the old order and the building of the new order might be very hectic, might be very painful, might be very bumpy, but I insist on seeing the light in the end of the tunnel. I don't know when we'll get to the light, how long the road would be, how bumpy, as I said, it would be, but I'm really optimistic that what we're seeing now, the demonstrations, it's not only about who would exactly be allowed to nominate the judges at the Supreme Court. It's much more than that. It's about the order in Israel, about what is the role of every sector in Israel in our general society. President Rivlin, our previous president, he was the first one to offer the concept of the 4 tribes that Israel is composed of: the secular sector, the Zionist religious, the ultra-Orthodox, and our Arabs, brothers and sisters, cousins, you choose. I think that what's happening now is the process of defining of how these 4 tribes should coexist in the upcoming decades. So it's a very hectic process. It makes me very much concerned. I wake up every day reading the news and I'm not happy. I'm very sad to see the polarization within our society. But I truly believe that this crisis is really an opportunity to shape our future together in the next decades. It wasn't exactly what you asked, but I think that this was the right answer at this point.
Churchill once was in a news conference, and the reporter asked a question, and he answered a different question. And the reporter said, Mr. Prime Minister, you didn't answer the question that I asked. And Churchill responded and said, you didn't ask the question I wanted to answer. So let's turn our attention to American Jewry. What is the role of the American Jewish community in a moment like this? Do we be silent and allow Israelis to determine their own path forward, whether it applies to its judiciary or religious life, without responding? Do we do what Jewish organizations have done in the past, which is largely contextualize what's happening in Israel to divert criticism? Those are questions that we have. Or do we begin to protest ourselves? Do we act on this as a community? So Dan and Sarah, how specifically have your organizations responded to the current crisis in Israel? My sense is that there are differences in this crisis than we've seen in the past. So I'll begin with Dan.
Well, there's a few that are hopefully obvious. So as I said, we supported the JFNA letter that went to, the open letter that went to the Prime Minister and to the opposition leader. We participated in the JFNA fly-in. So those are very tactical things. One of the things I will say is, with Yinam sitting next to me, is that I know that Yinam, Daniel, Itai, Rini, we have plenty of people we can call to communicate to. Always been an open line of communications. And we have issues big and small. That's one of our first stops, will be with the consulate here. One of the things that you will not see us do is scream from the rooftops. We think if you really want to effectuate change, have a conversation with the actual change makers, where we can potentially influence. So there are conversations happening. So my colleague in Jerusalem, Ofer Bavli, who runs JUS office there, is in constant communication with the government on a variety of issues. We support a specific region in Israel, Kiryat Gat, Lachish, and Shafir, and so we need to be interacting with the government at all times on issues that relate to the social services we help fund there. As part of those conversations, we are layering in conversations about what's happening, how the U.S. is perceiving what is happening in Israel. I think an important part of American Jewry, especially American official Jewry, organizational Jewry, is to say to Israel, you're going to do what you're going to do. You're an independent country. Understand the impact of what you do back here in the United States. And without belittling some of our neighbors, Canada, others, the relationship between the United States and Israel is the fundamental relationship Israel has with the world. So when Israeli conduct impacts things in the U.S., we think it's important to convey that. We will typically, the only time you'll see us come close to screaming from the rooftops is if a decision the Israeli government is making has a direct impact on the diaspora. So for example, when Prime Minister Netanyahu avoided the Kotel deal a number of years ago, then President Steve Nassiter was very vocal about it. We were participating heavily in the conversations regarding who's a Jew back in the 90s and participated in fly-ins to Israel at that point. So there are times when we'll speak loudly and scream from the rooftops, but right now for us it's quiet engagement and education. And then the other piece, and I'll hand it over to Sarah, is that we interact with a great many, especially in the interfaith space, the non-Jewish leaders, publications, and so forth. We are constantly communicating with them to make sure they're getting good information. And what we have found so far, largely, is if they feel like they've got an interlocutor with us, and they can have a conversation, they can really dig in with the issues, so far we've avoided, we think, a lot of bad op-eds, because they've been able to exercise whatever demon they want to exercise by talking to us on the phone, learning from the ground, sometimes connecting to Yinam and his team. They're getting real information as opposed to just spouting off. So we'll continue that.
Sarah?
Yeah, AJC very similarly. We take a multi-pronged approach. So our executive council, our highest governing body, traveled to Israel last month and met directly with Netanyahu. And what you'll see coming out from AJC is a much more balanced note publicly, but I can assure you that because of our close ties and relationship, long-standing over many decades with Bibi and with other members of the government, both under our current CEO, Ted Deutsch, and our previous CEO, David Harris, we speak much sharper directly to our friends because we have that tie, because we have these relationships that we can explain the impact. So we do that. We explain how what is happening in Israel is solely Israel. It is their country, it is their democracy, but it does have very real implications in America. It's very real implications for American Jews, very real implications for American Jews on college campuses, and the concerns we have about what they may be facing this coming semester or next fall. So we are doing a little bit of very direct advocacy at the highest levels of government, and we're also doing a mix of education, helping to remind and educate our Israeli friends and counterparts on how the impact will kind of resonate in America, but also to our fellow American Jews and to the non-Jewish public, helping to put out kind of an explainer, if you will, on the judicial reform process. What's at stake, why folks are so upset, what's on the table. And we just republished an updated version of that the other week, on Friday rather, because things have been in motion and kind of changing ever since. So it's important for us as American Jews are seeing a lot of these cry-ons. As you said, they may not be reading the news, and God bless Phil Stern, my regional board president. I'd say I don't need to read the news. Phil sends me the articles. So I feel like I've got it up to date, but not everybody is so lucky to have a Phil Stern in their life. So we want to make sure that we help educate them on what's really going on in a quick and digestible way, while also being available to have those longer conversations and really dig into folks' concerns. We're not going to have every answer. I'm an American living in Chicago. You know, I'm not an Israeli citizen. And there's still a role we have to play. There are still things that we can do, and it is appropriate to voice our concerns.
Well, speaking of criticism and speaking of unprecedented actions, last week, Israel's Consul General in New York, Asaf Zamir, made a comment expressing his displeasure to the proposed judicial overhaul in Israel. Quote, "I'm deeply concerned about the direction the country is going in right now. If you want to have a national home and you want to be everyone's home, you really must be democratic." Now, Mr. Consul General, I'm not going to ask you to comment upon what the ex-Consul General.
No, he's not ex. He's Consul General of Israel in New
Still-
York.
Still there.
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
So I know he was summoned.
And he's a good friend.
Right. I'm not going to ask you to comment directly on this, but I think we would all be enriched if you would talk for a few minutes about what is the role of the Consul General at a moment like this, and what's your message to this group tonight?
All right, thank you. I want to connect that to your previous questions because it is important and it's very much connected. And that's, I mean, you asked my American colleagues, what do you think about how do you see the role of American Jewry vis-a-vis Israel? And I want to see how I think Israel should look at American Jewry, and that really connects to your next question. So for me, it's not only your right, but it's your duty to speak out whenever you feel that something important is happening in Israel. Because on some issues, you're not only relevant, you're, I would say, stakeholders or shareholders of the state of Israel, of the Jewish state of Israel. Things like that has direct effect on you as Jews, like conversion, like Aliyah, the right of Aliyah, who's a Jew. The Cohen agreement, that I think personally that it was a great agreement, and I truly hope that one day it will be able to embrace it again. But not only that, things that important to you, as my colleagues well said, that affect your reality here, it's also important that you speak out, because if we speak about shared values, then if democracy is important to you, yeah, speak out for democracy in Israel. If LGBT rights are important for you, yes, speak out for LGBT rights in Israel. And that's no contradiction, by the way. You mentioned that some ministers of this government are, let me put it more diplomatically than you did, are very conservative, more conservative than what we've seen in the past, also on LGBT issues. But at the same time, I want to refer to what Prime Minister Netanyahu said just 2 months ago when he assumed office again as Prime Minister, that he would personally defend LGBT rights in Israel. And the Speaker of the Knesset, in the most conservative government that Israel has seen recently, the Speaker of the Knesset is openly gay. He brought for his assumption of the office, his husband and his children, and that was a great message to Israeli society. So what I'm trying to say is that the picture is more complex. Now, only today I saw on Israeli press a new poll that was conducted among Israeli citizens, asking them about the importance of American Jewry or world Jewry for them. 70% of them expressed a great sense of sympathy and close connection to the Jewish diaspora. 54%, and that's a huge number, 54% said that Jewish diaspora should express and speak out about issues that take place in Israel. Because in the end of the day, we understand that, I mean, there's a lot of differences between Jews here and here in America and in Israel, in many aspects. But in the end of the day, you have to remember that also the vast majority of Israel see you as our sisters and brothers. And family, I mean, has the right to speak out about things that happen within the family. So that's a very important message. Now, Rabbi Siegel, you know that since my day one here, and it's been a year and a half now, one of my topest priorities was reaching out both to the Jewish leadership here to think together how we can work together about how we can bring closer together the Jewish diaspora here and the Jews in Israel. And I'm also have reached out as much as I could, and I can still do much more to local communities here, Jewish communities here, because this dialogue is important to me. And if you remind me what was the last question is, I'll be able to direct.
I was asking you
Yes.
what your role is.
The role of the Consul General. So the role of the Consul General is I would say it's threefold. First, I need to what I think I need to do, and that's exactly what I was trying to refer to. I need to mediate the reality in Israel to local Jewry, because as Dan said, as Sarah said, even those of you who know very well Israel, it is only natural that you look at Israel in your American Jewish lens. That are sometimes different. So I feel that I sometimes need to mediate reality in Israel and maybe translate it into the local culture. Secondly, and even most importantly for me, I need to mediate American Jewry to Israel, to my bosses in Israel, to my government in Israel. Because as much as they understand the importance of American Jewry, me living here for a year and a half now, my understanding of the nuances of the light, of the aspects of different aspects of what it means to live today as a Jew in the United States. These aspects are not always understood in Israel, and I feel that that's my duty to deliver this message. And I think you sometimes don't see the results, but I think that we do it quite efficiently, because it has been 80% of our time in the recent months. And thirdly, and that is something that I'm definitely trying to do I hope to see some results in the upcoming year, is not only to make telephone calls or Zoom calls or whatever I do to try to explain to Israeli leadership the importance of the relations with American Jewry. I want to bring Israeli leadership to here, to the United States, to Chicago, because I truly believe that only by personal encounters are we able to really get people understand how close we are. Let me give you, I'm sorry to take one more minute, because I want to give a very important example, and Dan and I have been talking about it a couple of times. The GOF did a great thing a couple of years ago when brought in Chicago a group of Israeli MKs, members of the Knesset. Most of them, I think, from the center-right, if I'm not correct. It's been before my time. One of them, who holds a very important position today, was amazed, and he's totally secular. He's not Orthodox, has nothing to do with that. When he entered a Reform synagogue here in Chicago, a Reform temple, he was surprised, shocked, in a good way, to see that they have an Israeli flag inside. Because for many Israelis, the perception that is very twisted by this is the perception is that Reformers are half Jews, they do not like Israel, they don't care about Jewish heritage. So just seeing, an Israeli flag by the on a Kodesh, by the Ark, was a great shock for him in the most positive way. So this is why I believe that personal encounters are the best guarantee for better understanding. Thank you.
Thank you. My own thinking on this, comes not all that surprisingly from the Torah itself. The book of Leviticus, the words "Hocheach tochiach et amitecha," that you will surely criticize or rebuke your people, so that it is a mitzvah to speak out to your people. What most people are not aware of is that verse precedes Another verse that everybody in this room knows, V'ahavta l'reacha chamocha, love your neighbor as yourself. And so, if you care about someone, then you must undoubtedly be willing to criticize them when that's necessary. If you really care about someone, that's what you do. But you have to do it with love. And I can say, at least for myself, that I try to make that a guiding principle. I speak regularly about Israel. I make comments about Israel from the pulpit. I feel that part of a rabbi's job is to teach about Israel, to get people to go to Israel. This congregation has been very generous in supporting people and making sure that they could financially visit Israel as well. This is something that has been a very important part of my rabbinate. But also, there are times when we need to be critical. At least I think that's what rabbis need to do. But I think we have to do it in love. And I tried to do that in an e-blast that I sent out a few weeks ago, where I asked people to write a letter and all the rest. And what I'm interested in knowing from the three of you is how you read that. Did you read that as something a rabbi should be doing, or did you shake your head and say, I don't think that was such a great idea? And I would really appreciate honest answers, and because if you feel like I need to be rebuked, please. It won't be the first time in this building. So, Sarah, I'll begin with you.
I was hoping I wasn't first. I'm just kidding. No, I wasn't bothered. I was a little surprised, not by the fact that you felt compelled that you had to send it, but in thinking about the opening lines of your letter, that this was the first time in the 40 years that you've served here that you've ever had to write something like this. So for me, it was a moment of kind of underscoring where we are. But you're talking to someone who's with an advocacy organization. I'm all about American Jews exercising their voices and advocating for what they see. And I love that you gave them a very clear, direct, and respectful, hopefully if they took it in that way, manner in which they're able to share their concerns, who they're speaking to, the Israeli ambassador to the US, their direct contact, and opportunities to share the concerns. For me, I thought it was well framed, and I'm not just saying that as the newest member of Anshe Emet. This is how we encourage advocacy at AJC, to stick to the facts, focus on the policies, perhaps not the personalities, though personalities are a huge part of this current situation, and have folks feel like they've got an active role without, going elsewhere.
I should mention that Sarah and her husband are the newest members of Anshe Emet, so
Proudly
I
so.
appreciate that. Dan, how did you respond?
So I've been to enough of your sermons that I was not surprised that the email came out, or I was surprised at the message behind it. But my first thought was, this is going to sting somewhere. And I think the reason for that goes back to the nature of the point, is that when you love someone, you offer criticism and you do it in a fair and appropriate way. But I think we can also all agree that when the people that you're closest to criticize you or rebuke you, that hurts the most. So my first thought was, this is going to sting, and then I knew my phone would start. I'm pretty sure you sent it on a Friday, if I remember correctly, so I had a couple days worth to get ready. But I knew the process was going to carry on from there. And frankly, just sort of, if you pull back, so the concept of sending out an email and asking people to do that's one of those things that is, I used to work for AIPAC, and so mobilizing people to activate and to do different things, I think is an important piece of the puzzle, because it gets them to buy in more. My hope is that a lot of people who received your email didn't just copy, paste, send. I hope they went and read some of the art. I think you gave links to some things for them to read, and that they did a little bit of educating on their own, so that when Ambassador Herzog and Yinam received some of those emails, they were getting them from an informed voice. So just to sum it up, not surprised, but really interested to see what the sting was going to be.
Consul General.
Well, on the very practical level, I have to admit that I didn't like my mailbox being jammed by so many mails. But I mean, reading the content, and we try to respond to each one of them, right? Really, we did every effort to respond to each one of them. I have to tell you that, in a certain way, it made me happy because it showed that people cared, and I prefer 10 times more people being concerned than people being indifferent. And that's the biggest danger for me, that people start to be indifferent. So I think that by showing our concerns, sharing our concerns, even I would say ventilating sometimes our concerns, it makes us, it keeps us connected to the main, to the big vision, okay, that is Israel. Because Israel is not just a country. I hate to say that, I know it's a cliche. Israel is more than just a country. Israel is an idea, it's an ideal. It's not always perfect. It's not perfect, believe me, I live there. But it's indispensable. And we have to remember that too. So what we have to do is to share a concern in a positive and a constructive way. And I think that this is what your community members did, and that was very important for me.
I appreciate that. But recently, Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich was invited to the UJA, not the UJA, Israel Bonds in New York for a fundraising dinner. And hundreds of people came out to protest. And I began to wonder to myself, how would you define the limits of criticism for the American Jewish community? Are there limits? How would you understand those limits? I'm going to start with you, Dan. Are there limits to criticism of Israel? Where you would say to someone, that's out of bounds. We can't, that's beyond the pale for the American Jewish community.
Well, I think there's some obvious red lines. I mean, if you're calling into question the legitimacy of the state of Israel, that's out of bounds. If you're going to criticize Israel in a context that is different from any other country, that hold Israel to a different standard, I think that's out of bounds. If you're going to really impose a set of rules and restrictions on Israel that you just wouldn't impose on anybody else, I wouldn't go for that. At the same point, when it comes to another one of my former employers, Israel Bonds, and I'm a holder and investor in the bonds market, what I would just say is that a number of organizations made the decision to not meet with Minister Smotrich, and I think they have every right to do that. I think that communities, organizations, institutions set their own morals, set their own rules, and if they don't want to meet with him, that's fine. There could be impact from that decision to not have that meeting in the future. So they have to weigh that, and what the impact of that is going to be on their membership base and on their future ability to do their jobs. The same way that when my colleagues in Israel, they can't shut the door to any member of Knesset because they have work that has to get done. People have to be fed, houses need to be built, social services need to be provided. Shutting the door doesn't make any sense doing our work in Israel. So organizations, people will make up their minds about meetings with someone like Minister Smotrich, and some will and some won't. And you can criticize, I think, his positions and policies. I agree with what Sarah said before. It's not about the personalities. Yes, they play a role. But I hope people will stick to criticizing the policies. And I also think we have to be very careful. Are we criticizing Israel or are we criticizing the government of Israel? Because I think everybody in this room is a Zionist, no matter how you define it. And it's one thing to say I'm going to criticize the policies of the government of Israel. It's another thing to say I'm criticizing Israel. I will try to stick to the policies.
Anything you'd like to add?
I agree completely, and I think one thing that AJC takes into consideration in moments like this is, we're not interested in creating red lines for other organizations, but for us, where the personality becomes more of a distraction than being able to talk about the policies and principles, that's yet again another layer for us that will say, not that we had any intention to meet with Smotrich while he was stateside or otherwise. It's another calculation for us as we're considering who are the best people to engage with in our advocacy work. when their personality and what's happening around them becomes so much more of a distraction than the actual issues and the policies. That for us is part of our configuration.
I do want to say one thing on my own part, on my own behalf. I'm a student of Jewish history. And one of the things that I've learned through my studies of Jewish history is that the greatest force of destruction throughout Jewish history for the Jewish people are the Jewish people.
Oh, yeah, sure.
I'm painfully aware that the kingdom that David built ended in a civil war through his grandson. It didn't last 70 years. I'm painfully aware that it was a civil war against the Hasmoneans that ended the next period of Jewish statehood, of Jewish independence. And as we are coming to the 75th anniversary of the State of Israel, what concerns me most is the divisions within Israel. But as a conservative rabbi, I am pained and enraged when I hear the non-Orthodox community denigrated, and when I see legislation that, while it did not pass, will continue to create greater and greater constriction for the non-Orthodox community at the Kotel. And I must say that, and I'm not asking for a comment here, this is a statement on my part. I must say that the new Pesach laws that have been passed, where chametz cannot be served in hospitals, and the efforts now to change the public bus systems, etc., and travel in the country on Shabbat, they make me very nervous and make me very angry. As one rabbi, I understand them, and I'd like to think that I understand the thinking behind them, but I do think that they are really wrong-minded and very dangerous for the unity of the Jewish people, and certainly diaspora Jewry. And the exact people that I want to go to Israel, I'm also nervous about that. And I wonder if, rather than commenting about that, are you worried about how this will impact tourism, Jewish tourism? It won't affect Christian tourism, which, by the way, remains very strong. But I do wonder if you are concerned if the present tension in Israel and protests, etc., and the controversies are going to affect tourism amongst American Jews. What do you think, Sarah?
I mean, I can say anecdotally, I've heard that be part of folks' consideration, and I'm pained to hear that. And I try and gently push back on them. Those that are concerned, well, if I'm going to travel with Israel, EJC, in full disclosure, we've got our global policy conference in Tel Aviv in June, 11th through the 14th, if you'd like to join. But we've got some folks who are concerned that, what does that mean? If I'm going to travel with you to Israel, does that mean that I'm supporting the current actions of the Israeli government? I said, no. Did your travel to any other country during any other period during the last 5 years meant you, did you go to China? Do you support the policies of China? No. So I try and gently, more gently than I just did right here, reframe that for folks. Because I think if American Jews get caught up in thinking like that, it'll do a greater disservice to all of us than it will to the Israeli tourism ministry. But it concerns me. Any moment where American Jews are saying, I don't know if I want to go there, or worse, I don't know if I have a place there. And to Yinam's point earlier, I was very grateful to be able to voice that very concern from our members when he brought a director from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here a couple months ago. They brought them here to Chicago in part to listen to American Jewry just as the beginning of this crisis was unfolding. And we did not hold back. We were very explicit with what we were hearing from our community members and their concern that they felt like if the progression were to play out as it currently was, at this point, maybe 9 or 10 weeks ago, would they have a place in Israel? I'm like, I'm used to that conversation from young people, college students, it concerns me, but it's nothing new. Like, but when one of my, 78-year-old donors is saying they don't feel like they have a place in Israel, I'm like, I've never heard that before. That's what makes me nervous. And that's one of the things that I'm working on stateside to address, because I don't want that schism happening here. I don't want that schism happening between American Jews and Israel, regardless of what may be coming out of the government. Our ties are stronger than that.
Am I afraid that, yes, I'm afraid. I'm less gentle. Anybody who says to me, I'm contemplating canceling a trip to Israel, I will push them very strongly to not cancel that trip to Israel. And I'll I'll use no uncertain terms for that, and just to show how important I think that is. My youngest daughter will be there for 3 weeks this summer, and she's fully aware of the job that I do and the issues I've been dealing with, and there's no question about that, and I've communicated that as best I can to her friends and her friends' parents that this needs to happen. People need to be going now, because I think that, as I said before, that ends up being the great clarifier, because once you're there and you can see things differently, you'll understand things differently. So I fear that some people who are the casual traveler to Israel might take a pass because of what they see happening, but if they'll call me, they'll get the exact opposite recommendation.
I have to admit that I don't totally understand this question. I mean, many people reach out to me asking if they should go to Israel right now, but in the sense of, is it safe, is it secure to go to Israel because of the demonstrations? I say, on the contrary, of course. It is. This is the best time to go to Israel. If you support Israel, Israel is so much more than this or that government. Israel is its government, but it's also its civil society, its high-tech sector, its Arab population. It has many faces. And if you feel that you support certain things in Israel, go and support them. Speak out for them. I mean, this is important. You're shareholders in Israel. I insist on saying that all the time. And if you feel that, and Rabbi Siegel, I grew up, my house is still would be considered a liberal, modern Orthodox house, whatever that means, okay? I came to America and understood that it means nothing because it's about who you are and not how you are defined. And that's a great thing about American Jewry. But at the same time, I say, I'm for religious pluralism in Israel. And if you care about that, and of course you care, support those who strive in Israel for that.
Absolutely.
And, Americans say, put your money where your heart is. I think this is the time to do that. This is a strong message for American Jewry. Don't give up on Israel. Just find what you care of in Israel and support that.
I can only say that at Anshe Emet, we're planning a congregational trip to Israel a year from this summer, and it's part of our 150th anniversary, and it is a way for us to continue our strong Zionist ties to the state of Israel. So one last question, and then we'll turn it over to questions in the audience. I realize that prophecy was outlawed a long time ago by the rabbis, so I'm not asking anybody to play the role of the prophets. But from your seat, do you see over the next decade the relationship between American Jewry strengthening or weakening with Israel? Where do you see us in 10 years? Yinam, I'll start with you.
I want to challenge you with a counter question, because I think it's very important, because one of my concerns about the debate about the relations between the American Jewish diaspora and Israel is that it is always in the context of Israel. And I think that a fair question is, where do you see American Jewry in 10 years? One question that is derived from it is its relations with Israel. But I think it's a much bigger question than that.
I think you're 100% right. I think that we are going through one of the great transformations in American Jewish history. It is a challenging time. I also think it's a very exciting time. And I will also tell you that anyone in the American Jewish community who says they can see more than 3 years out is kidding themselves. But I think the question is an important one, because really implicit within the question was a challenge. I think that people in leadership roles have a responsibility to our children right now to build that love of Israel, and also teach children that if you love something, you can also criticize. But we have a responsibility to continue to build on that love and find that balance. So I think that we can all agree on that idea as the goal for the future. But I can say that if we're not careful, that we'll see a lessening. That would be my view from where I sit, that I think that we have a real responsibility. A generation that grew up never asking the question, why Israel, is leaving us, right? They're retiring, they're aging, they're leaving us. A new generation that does ask that question is rising up. And so how will we meet that challenge? That's the, I think that's the test of leadership at the end of the day. If you have a question, I'd be very happy to entertain it. If you have a question, please make sure it's a question and not a statement, if we wouldn't mind. And if you're going to ask the question, please stand up and speak loudly, because we don't have a microphone to. So please, Philippe, will you start us off?
Philippe, hi, welcome and thank you for your talk. A quick question. The generation today of rabbis are very committed to the state of Israel in one fashion or another. What's the next generation going to be like? How do you prepare the next generation? Because it's easy to talk about the American people and the American individual and the Israelis. There's also, aside from the leadership, they're very committed and position themselves as Zionists in one fashion or another. What about the rabbis? Thank you.
Oh, I'm getting asked questions here. It's a great question, Philippe. And, you know, for those of us who paid attention to the recent rabbinic search, that was a question. That was a real question that was asked directly to the rabbinic candidates. I'll give you the exact question that we asked. The question was, if a young person came to you, high school student, and said to you, Rabbi, what I learned in religious school about Israel, I'm finding to be not true, or there are a lot of holes in what I learned. And I have come to a point where I not only am not supporting the state of Israel, but I don't think the state of Israel is legitimate. That was the question. And the question to the rabbi was, how would you respond to that young person? And what I would say is that if you don't have a response to that young person, then you're not the right person for the job here. And that, I think, is one of the challenges that we're facing. Because how do you build rabbinic leadership? We had a wonderful conversation with Rabbi Brad Artson last month on rabbinic education. And he runs the Ziegel Rabbinical School. And that rabbinical school made a decision to not send rabbis or not require rabbinical students to visit Israel for the year, but lessen the amount of time in Israel. That is a very controversial issue as to how to instill a love of Israel into the students. Now, he had an interesting answer to the question, but I think your question is the right one, because congregational rabbis have the most power, at least in the present time, on that issue. And I think that it is a real responsibility that we have, and we have to take it seriously. And that means, by the way, to also create communities where real dialogue can go on. And we're working at that. That is a challenging issue. And as you know, we've brought people in to help us with that conversation. But rabbinic leadership is vital, and I think it's something that we have to pay very careful attention to and challenge our seminaries, rabbinic seminaries, to be thinking about that issue. Other questions? Okay, go ahead. Please say your name and ask the question.
My name is Cameron Smith. Thank you for the panel tonight. I run a pre-K to 12th grade school. We're next door to a pre-K to 8th grade school. You talked about the importance of education, the importance of fighting indifference. I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit at JUF and AJC about what we can do as Zionists to advocate for the programs we have in K-12 schools for young people.
So I'm going to repeat the question to make sure that people who are watching online heard the question. How can we take the steps that are needed in pre-K through high school to talk about advocacy for Israel? Yes? Okay. Go ahead.
So I think for AJC's perspective, it's to have programs. I know JUF and AJC both do. In AJC, our world is for high school students, leaders for tomorrow. And we present them with a very straightforward view of Israel. There's nothing to hide, but we try and prepare them at the beginning when we first started Lift. We try and prepare them for what they face in college. And now as we hear from our students, this is what they're facing in high school already. So we're helping them be able to talk about Israel, be able to wrestle with it themselves and not feel pressured in any one specific area, but understand the history of it. And I think it's critical that our youth be provided with those safe opportunities to be able to ask questions and to not feel ashamed or that they're going to get in trouble for questioning Israel, not its existence or its right to exist, but the history of it and some of its challenges. It's an imperfect country just as America is. So I don't know if I'm actually answering your question besides just to say along with you, yes, these programs are so critical. I think there should be more of them. I would love for us to be able to have every Jewish high school student and then some enrolled in a program like what our organizations offer. Hopefully there'll be funders out there who agree with that and want to come and create that reality with us.
Cameron, I'm just curious, what kind of school is it you run?
I run a project-based learning-focused school in downtown called Emet Day School.
Okay. So not a religiously affiliated.
It's not. I'd say it's about a quarter Jewish.
Okay.
It's founded by my family's Jewish values, but it's a secular day school.
Got it. Okay. My own personal experience. So I have two daughters who graduated from here at Bernard Zell. I have a number of friends whose kids have graduated from the Chicago Jewish Day School. Many kids from, I know a lot of people from Schechter. I feel really confident about most of the education when it comes to Israel that these kids are getting in the Jewish day schools. The tough nut to crack is the non-Jewish day school, which I understand is your school. So one of the most important things is get them to Israel. With self-promotional, JUF has a trip called Israel Now. It's for 8th graders. Their second cohort of the year just landed 3 days ago. And I think that is terribly important. It's a specific program started by Jewish parents in Chicago called Ta'am, and then it became Israel Now. And it was designed because the Bernard Zell kids, Chicago Jewish Day School, Schechter, Ida Crown, they get to Israel. That's going to happen. It was the kids who go to the public schools in the suburbs and the city. How do we get them? So that's one. And statistically, everybody knows that it's not the first trip that gets them connected to Israel. It's the second trip. So if we know these kids are all going to go on birthright someday, we got to get them there earlier. That 8th grade trip becomes phenomenally important. And so I'd make a strong recommendation for that. The good news is in Chicago, JUF, we did our decennial population study, which came out last year, and we found that over 60% of Chicago Jews have been to Israel. We are beating the national average by somewhere between 7 to 10 percentage points, I believe. That's a great number. A lot of that is driven by those programs, Ta'am, Now Israel Now, and so forth. So the connection is that second trip, so work with us to find a way to get them on that first trip. And then the other piece of the puzzle is parents have to engage. If the school is going to teach a class on world history and Middle East history and so forth, parents have to engage. My daughter's a sophomore in high school. There was something happening in the Middle Eastern class. She wasn't in the class, but other students were. I found out about it. I engaged with the school. They fixed the problem. So parents have to engage. And the other statistic I'll pull out from that shows that we have the right parents to engage is that in that same decennial study, we found out that 75% of Jews in Chicago consider Israel essential to their Judaism. So we have the power, we just have to utilize it.
Other questions? Okay, 1 second. Oh, go ahead.
It seems to me that my question is, what can we do here, or what can Jewish organizations do about what I take to be the hostility of the current government to conservative and reform Judaism? I'll just put it that way.
So the question was, what can we do here to counter what some would consider to be the hostility of the present government towards non-Orthodox Jewry?
Rabbi, you'll help me remember the date, but I think it was 2018 or 19, a list came out of Israel about rabbis for whom can and cannot perform conversions in this country, based upon, I forget which rabbinate put it out in Israel. That was abhorrent. We made sure your predecessor knew what our position was. We communicated that up through the chain of command. We did it publicly, and that was one of those times where we screamed from the rooftops. So we will continue to do that because, as Yinam said himself, when it comes to matters about who's a Jew, conversion, aliyah, and so forth, those are direct diaspora things, we have to speak because that's what those policies are speaking to us, so we need to speak back to those policies. So I think AJ Committee, ourselves, ADL, APAC was the same way. When I was there on those particular issues, that was not a time for quiet.
Literally, my pulse is racing thinking about that because I had the great privilege of converting here at Anshe Emet under Rabbi Siegel. Nobody is going to tell me that I'm not Jewish enough for Israel. Full stop.
Okay. Question?
As the Consul General knows, 1 out of 30 non-Orthodox Jews have ever been to Israel. And I haven't heard of too many Jews who canceled their trips to Mexico with all the cartels.
Jack, I know there's a question in here somewhere.
Well, I'm getting to the question, but
So-
it is a minute. Look, Israel is beginning to change to a more conservative, traditional state as American Jews are drifting away from being Jewish. How do you change that, Rabbi?
Well, I would contest that. I would contest your premise. As I said earlier, so the question was, demographically, Israel is becoming a more traditional state. The birth rate in the Haredi community and the Orthodox community far exceed the liberal community in Israel. That's not true? Can I get Jack, you asked.
Israel is in Yesha, in Judea Samaria. The religion Zionists. How else would
So I think I was trying to agree with you, but what I was simply saying, okay, this is last chance here. So clearly, we're seeing it in the governments that are being that while it was a very narrow victory for the Netanyahu government, it was the signs are on the wall that there are changes going on in the state of Israel. And ironically, at the very same time, the American Jewish community, certainly in the non-Orthodox world, are very engaged in a more liberal, more progressive approach to politics. And I would also suggest there are real changes going on in the American Jewish community. I, as one rabbi, would be not being truthful if I said that if I didn't have concerns about the direction of some in the American Jewish community. The fact that here in Lakeview, the largest group, the fastest growing group this is the area around Lakeview is the fastest growing Jewish community in Chicago. And in Lakeview, there is a very significant number of people, and growing, that write none when they are asked for their religion. So if that didn't concern me as a rabbi, then I should really just stop being a rabbi. However, I don't think this is the first time in Jewish history that people have shried Gewalt at a particular moment in Jewish history. I continue to believe in the Pinteleiyad. I do. I believe that there is that spark. I see Jews going out and creating different types of communities. 20 years ago, when the American Jewish community started paying careful attention to the interfaith marriage rates, everyone said this is the end of American Jewry. Here at Anshe Emet, we see more and more interfaith couples coming into the congregation wanting to engage Jewishly. What happens online Jewishly is something that none of us really fully appreciate. I don't discount the American Jewish future at all. I am not of the belief that the American Jewish community, the non-Orthodox community, will dissipate and be gone 20, 30 years from now. I'm not of that belief. If I'm proven wrong, I'm proven wrong. But throughout Jewish history, Jews have remained Jewish no matter what. And we're going through a change. I can't tell you what it's going to look like on the other end, but I am not throwing in the towel. I am not shrieking Gewalt, and I think that great things are ahead of us. We just don't exactly know how that will ultimately play out. I can tell you that this congregation has come through the storm, and I'm very proud of what we've accomplished here, but the work is just beginning. And that also applies to the work that we have with the State of Israel.
I just want to add on to that, if I could. That the nuns, so there's the fastest growing group of people in the Jewish community are the Jews, but not by religion. But they're still self-identifying as Jewish. And so we have to find a different model. How are we connecting them to this communal experience that we all have here? Because they are still self-identifying. And if we look at our population study from 2010 to 2020, the Jewish population of Chicago actually grew. Most of that was because of looking at the interfaith community, because what we're seeing is a dramatic increase of interfaith families choosing to raise children as Jewish, and then as Jewish aging and deciding I am identifying as. I may not be a Jew by religion, but they're still defining themselves.
Our Jews by Choice program continues to grow every year.
And if I may, Rabbi Siegel, I just want to add one more thing, because I want to challenge the assumption that Israel is becoming more conservative. I don't think that looking at the Knesset is the right way to assess whether Israel is conservative or not, because the current Knesset, after the last elections, and the current composition of the government is unique, and it has to do with internal political issues, very specific political circumstances. But if you look, and I think for me one of the best, most important measurements is the positions of in Israeli society towards the LGBT community. 20 years ago, among secular Israelis, there were, a lot of hesitation about, the acceptance of LGBT people today, and that's a huge change in the last decade or two. Not only that it is openly, acceptable, but even among the most conservative, not Haredi, but the most conservative, you would see much more acceptance, much more discussion about the role that LGBT should play in the religious life in Israel. You would see Sephardic families, okay, that are more traditional, more leaning towards the right wing, more traditional. You would see on the Friday night, on the Shabbat table, all the siblings sitting together with their parents. One of them is Shas, ultra Haredi. One of them is gay, who just came from, going after Shabbat dinner to party in Tel Aviv. And they're all accepted. And I think that is the great new thing about Israel. So while it is, to some extent, more traditional, I think that in many aspects it became more and more liberal and more inclusive. And I think that for the long run, this is great news.
I want to thank our panelists for a informed and interesting conversation. Very grateful to everyone, and I'm grateful for you for turning out, and thanks for joining us online.